You know, I really think that's true. Everything you said brings a lot of memories back to me. But Ted's life was really tied up so much in aviation. Anybody that's lived here even for a short while knows that you only get to places by getting on an airplane and going there. And Ted was profoundly affected, of course, when his first wife, Anne, was killed in an aircraft accident out here, and Ted fortunately did survive. But he did so much. I could do a long story about the things he did to try to make aviation safer. I lost my own husband in a tragic aircraft out in the country close to where Ted went down. So I think that was one of the bonds we had. But he was so Alaskan in everything he did. And so in some ways, and I've talked to some friends, it's almost fitting that when Ted went, he went doing something he loved, and it was a result of an air accident. It's almost uncanny in a way.
Jack?
Well, he was a hard worker.
Oh my.
Incredible energy. He was honest, and he was very intelligent. Mm-hmm. And for a public servant, that's what you want. Yeah. And I did not agree with him on some of the national issues, but he was senator. I was not. He loved what he did. And he did it very well. I wonder how many men that I know spent their whole life, basically, doing what they wanted to do. And Ted did.
I think that's true. It even goes back to the Eisenhower's day when he was with the Department of Interior. He really zeroed in on all the big things that hit us here in this state, you know, whether it's ANTSCA or ANILCA or on and on and on. He played a role.
Well, he's a very good lawyer. And the kind of lawyer that the more you gave him, the more he liked it. And that's the way he was as a senator. Yeah. You just pile things on Ted, yeah, no more, more. That's a remarkable guy.
I wanted to say a little bit about his biography. At one point, I got very interested in writing the whole history of Ted Stevens, and it's something I worked on, and it wasn't satisfactory to me, and it's not that I got finished with it, and I didn't know quite where it was going, but I did a lot of homework on his childhood in Indianapolis and in California, and I actually hired somebody in Indianapolis to take a lot of photographs of the neighborhood he grew up in the house he grew up in. Actually, I gave these to Ted, and he was very appreciative of that and confirmed this was the house he grew up in. He came from a troubled family. His parents had a lot of personal disagreements. They split up. They came back together. He lived with his grandfather, and I think the grandfather died in 1932. The grandfather seems to have been somebody that Ted really loved and felt very, very close to. And when the grandfather died, he was shipped off to other relatives in California, and that's where he became the surfer of Redondo Beach, and a young football player, as we saw in the paper, and eventually a student and graduate at UCLA.
How did Ted get to Alaska? I don't know that story. Was it through, because he'd had an Alaska connection before he went back east, I think.
Yeah, he graduated from law school, worked for a law firm in Washington, D.C., that had a client in Fairbanks. I think it was Usabelli, actually.
That's correct.
Yeah. So he went to Fairbanks as a lawyer to do that work, and he ended up, was he hired up there, Michael?
Yeah, he was hired up there. He drove the Alaska Highway in early 1953 and became the young prosecutor in Fairbanks.
Yeah. And then the secretary, not Seton, but McKay, brought him back to Washington in the Interior Department. And then, of course, Seton followed, Seton being the newspaper man, friend of Bill Snedden's, close to Alaska. And Ted became Mr. Alaska in the Interior Department.
Because he was fighting so hard for statehood.
Sure.
And it was funny, I think it was in 1977, he admitted to breaking the law by going from the executive and going to lobby the legislative branch, and how hard he did it. He's like, it was totally wrong. But at that point, what were they going to do? Sell us back to, you know, put us on eBay? I mean, what were they going to do? But here he was like, yeah, I did it. You know, and I just, you know, that going forward, and all of the different pieces of legislation, I think when you look at everybody's work compiled next to each other, there aren't very many people that got more legislation passed through.
But you know, he had a really unique, he worked across the aisle, and I worry about the state of politics right now, about people's ability to do that. But some of his best friends were of the opposite party, and he could work with them on significant stuff, you know, and you've seen some of that coming out in the press. He almost was without a letter behind his name. He just dealt with people on issues.
Well, it didn't seem to matter when people came back to Washington to see him, or Alaskans here. I don't think that he necessarily asked, did you vote for me? Like, you know, we've heard other people say, my constituents are the people that voted for me.
I wonder who that would be.
That is,
yeah.
You know, and
we
just
can come up with a name or two.
But I thought it was interesting. I got a lot of flack because I was so critical of, you know, some of the legislation in the last, that he was part of in the last decade. I was very critical of you know, retroactive torture and the Patriot Act and these sort of things. I thought that he had become very disconnected because I thought those were such human rights issues. And being so sad when you know, when the news came in that he had been killed, I was getting a lot of flack. Like, you know, how can you be sad? And people were writing in and saying things like, when I got a letter from a lady that said her sister had been killed on the Alaska Airlines flight off the coast of California several years ago. And that as soon as Ted heard about that, he flew to meet with the families where they were at in Los Angeles to comfort them and to be able to look them in the eye and say, you're going to make it through this. And that she had never voted for him, and she couldn't call in because she wouldn't be able to stop crying. And that relationship is very, very unique, don't you think? You're smiling, Jack.
I never voted for him.
Well, by golly, I did.
Did he know?
We're personal friends.
Yeah.
We didn't talk politics. I was the head of the Democratic Party in the state for a while. But I liked the guy as a human being. I didn't agree with some of his positions, particularly his supporting the defense budget, what I thought sort of automatically. But no, he was a marvelous guy.
Did he know that you never voted for him?
Oh, I got to tell an anecdote from my wife. Both of us Democrats. Martha was a Democrat. But Ted was running against a guy that Martha really didn't like at all. And so she changed her party to Republican, voted for Ted, and then went back and registered Democrat. And when Ted heard about it, he wrote her a note. This is my Christmas miracle.
I was going to go back a little bit to Ted's early days in Fairbanks, which I was very interested in because I grew up in Fairbanks, and it amazed me to realize I started reading the newspapers in Fairbanks, and before that New York City, where my family had lived for a while, and I got to learn essentially how to read and interested in public affairs through the newspapers. And there was this guy, this prosecutor in the paper, the district attorney, whose name was Ted Stevens. He was in the paper all the time. And I wrote about this, and it does humble me to realize I was a 9-year-old boy reading about crime in Fairbanks and the crusading district attorney Now I'm a white-haired old man receiving Social Security, and I'm still reading about Ted Stevens.
Yeah.
There really
And now you're writing about him.
Yeah, and there really is nothing like this. I wanted to tell you that he was appointed in the summer of 1953, and it was a political appointment. The district attorney it was Eisenhower had just become president, and they were going to make some changes. And the truth of the matter is, this makes some people happy in retrospect, there were very few Republican lawyers in Fairbanks. Because it had been smart to be a Roosevelt-Truman Democrat, among other things, just from self-interest. So Ted was picked as the United States Attorney. And within less than 2 months, there was a sensational murder. Cecil Wells, who was a very prominent businessman, he'd been here in Anchorage, in fact, he's buried out here in Anchorage, was murdered in the Northward building, the apartment building. And arrested was his wife, and as the newspapers of that time put it, her Negro boyfriend, who was a drummer, a jazz drummer. So you had this story of prominent businessman murdered while in bed, wife arrested, indicted, and boyfriend, jazz musician. This story made Life magazine. Diane Wells, who was arrested for murder, was in Life magazine. It was in papers in London. It was all over the United States, and this was essentially Ted's first big case. And he had got the police chief was fired. There was a feeling of his competence. It was a great test of the young district attorney, and it did not have a satisfactory end because Diane Wells, the beautiful, I think she was 5th wife of the older man, took her own life in Hollywood. She's buried in Hollywood, and there was no way to continue with the trial because they were going to use the boyfriend and the beautiful girl against one another in the trial, and so that ended. But it was an incredible test of the community and of Ted because it was on the front page every day for weeks.
Well, and this, you know, in looking at that, I can't imagine having Ted Stevens prosecuting you. Really, I can't.
Well, I can tell you a story about that.
Well, we got to run to a break.
To that, yeah.
We got to run to a break. We'll be right back with more Up North.